Hey, so glad you got here. We were totally waiting for you, just about to listen to a story that drifts through quiet marshes where the mist hangs so low it seems determined to borrow your boots, where forgotten reeds whisper to one another as though they've been keeping the same secret for centuries. And where every ripple across dark water makes even the boldest traveler wonder whether it was caused by a fish or by someone who forgot they were supposed to stay buried in history. Don't worry, it sounds much scarier than it really is. Most medieval travelers survived perfectly well. Well, enough of them did to keep telling stories. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, I'd love for you to leave a comment telling everyone where you're listening from and what your local time is. It's always strangely comforting, knowing this little fireside gathering stretches across so many places. Now settle in, get comfortable, and just relax. Today's tale starts like this. There was once a man who had spent most of his life walking roads that sensible people preferred to avoid, not because he enjoyed danger particularly. He simply possessed the unfortunate talent of arriving somewhere exactly when everyone else was leaving. His name mattered very little now. In time, people stopped introducing him by name and instead referred to him as the fellow who somehow survives. It was not the sort of title anyone proudly embroidered onto a cloak, but it proved surprisingly useful. He traveled alone through northern valleys, sleepy forests, forgotten hills, and villages that seemed permanently wrapped in morning fog. Everywhere he went, he listened far more than he spoke. Stories had become his trade, not writing them, collecting them. Some men gathered silver, others collected horses. He gathered impossible tales, the way squirrels gathered nuts, although admittedly with far less climbing and significantly more damp socks. One autumn afternoon, after several days following a winding trade road, he reached a lonely settlement perched beside an enormous marsh. The village seemed almost reluctant to exist. Its cottages leaned away from the water, as though afraid the marsh might someday decide to reclaim them. Fishing nets hung drying beside crooked fences. Children played close to their homes, but never wandered toward the reeds. Even the village dogs seemed to regard the marsh with deep suspicion. Now, dogs are usually confident creatures. They bark at carts. They bark at strangers. Some appear perfectly willing to bark at invisible concepts. Yet these dogs remained oddly quiet whenever the wind drifted across the water. That alone was enough to catch his attention. The marsh stretched farther than the eye could comfortably follow. Its pools reflected pale clouds with such perfect stillness that sky and water seemed to exchange places. Clusters of reeds whispered endlessly together. Dark pools appeared and disappeared beneath drifting mist. Occasionally, a bird burst upward without warning, startling absolutely everyone except itself. He rented a corner inside a modest farmhouse and spent the evening sharing supper with several villagers. The meal consisted mainly of coarse bread, onions, smoked fish, and a stew whose exact ingredients were politely left unexplained. In medieval cooking, curiosity was often less satisfying than hunger. Conversation flowed slowly. Harvests, weather, broken wagons, missing sheep. A neighbor whose goose apparently believed itself ruler of the entire valley. Honestly, some things never change. Only after the candles had burned, lower did the oldest woman at the table quietly ask him why he had come. "I follow stories," he answered. The room grew noticeably quieter. Several faces turned toward the windows, where darkness had settled across the marsh. Finally, an old fisherman gave a tired smile. "Then you've arrived in the wrong place. Or perhaps exactly the right one." The fisherman sighed. "There are stories, but no one follows them anymore." That sentence hung in the room longer than anyone seemed comfortable with. The traveler waited. Silence often persuaded people better than questions. Eventually, the old man continued. Long before their grandparents' had lived there had once been a kingdom, somewhere beneath the marsh itself. Not beside it, not beyond it, beneath it. Its towers had disappeared, its roads had sunk, its halls had vanished under dark water and endless mud. Only the marsh remained. According to the oldest tales, there had once been bells that could occasionally be heard beneath the earth during certain autumn mornings. Others claimed lights drifted through the fog. Some insisted that smooth stone roads sometimes appeared beneath shallow water before fading away again by sunset. No one agreed about exactly what had happened. Everyone agreed that nobody should go looking. Naturally, this made the traveler immediately interested. Human beings possess many admirable qualities. Ignoring perfectly reasonable warnings is certainly one of the more consistent ones. The old woman shook her head. Those who search never find riches. What do they find? They stop asking questions. Nobody elaborated. Outside, wind rustled through the reeds. Somewhere far away, a heron called across the marsh. Its lonely cry echoed over still water until even the echo seemed uncertain where to settle. The traveler stepped outside after supper. Cool air carried the smell of wet earth, moss, and distant rain. Moonlight spread silver across pools that reflected stars almost too clearly. The marsh looked peaceful, peaceful enough to fool nearly anyone. He walked only a short distance before noticing something odd. The reeds nearest the village bent with the breeze. The reeds farther away remained perfectly still, as though two different winds had chosen two different worlds. He blinked. Moments later, they all swayed together again. Perhaps he had imagined it. Travel could play tricks upon tired eyes, or perhaps the marsh preferred introducing itself slowly. The following morning, he spoke with more villagers. None wished to guide him. Several refused even to discuss the old kingdom. One elderly basket weaver admitted that her grandfather had claimed to see carved stones beneath clear water during a drought many decades earlier. A shepherd insisted strange music occasionally drifted over the marsh at dawn. Another man laughed loudly at every tale, rather suspiciously loudly. Sometimes the people who laugh hardest are simply hoping nobody notices they're frightened. One peculiar bit of local folklore especially caught his attention. Every autumn, villagers tossed small loaves of bread into the marsh before sunrise. Not as worship, not exactly as superstition. Simply because, as one woman calmly explained, it's easier to keep old promises than discover why they were made. It sounded wonderfully unreasonable, which often meant it had once been perfectly sensible. Historical records are full of forgotten customs that appear bizarre today, yet originally solved problems nobody remembers anymore. That afternoon, he stood upon a weathered hill overlooking the endless wetlands. Mist drifted lazily between scattered pools. Birds circled overhead. The marsh stretched endlessly toward the horizon like an ocean that had grown tired of waves. Somewhere beneath that quiet landscape, if the stories held even the smallest grain of truth, an entire kingdom had vanished from the world, not destroyed. Forgotten. He tightened the straps of his satchel, checked his boots, looked once more toward the silent water. Whatever waited beneath those reeds had remained hidden for generations, and for reasons he could not fully explain, not greed, nor glory, nor even simple curiosity. He felt as though the marsh had already noticed him standing there, as though somewhere beneath the still water, buried beneath centuries of mud and silence, something ancient had just opened its eyes. Morning arrived quietly, not with brilliant sunlight, but with a pale gray glow that seemed to seep into the world rather than shine upon it. The traveler left the village before most chimneys had begun releasing their thin trails of smoke. Behind him, shutters remained closed. Ahead of him, The marsh waited with remarkable patience. It was the sort of landscape that made distances difficult to judge. A cluster of reeds that appeared only a short walk away might require an hour to reach. A lonely willow reflected so perfectly upon the water that it seemed to possess twin trunks growing toward one another. Even the air felt strangely thick, carrying the scent of wet moss, peat, and the faint sweetness of decaying lilies. The villagers had refused to accompany him. They had also refused to stop him. There was an important difference. One elderly fisherman had simply handed him a long ash walking staff before sunrise. "You'll want this." "To fight wolves?" The old man chuckled. "If wolves are standing in the marsh, you've already found stranger problems." That earned the first genuine smile of the morning. The staff proved useful almost immediately. Every few steps, he pressed it into the soft ground before placing his weight forward. Sometimes, the earth felt solid enough to support a wagon. Other times, the pole sank nearly to its handle without warning. The marsh possessed a wicked sense of humor. It looked perfectly welcoming right until it tried swallowing one of your boots. Fortunately, he had learned years ago that pride weighed considerably more than leather. Losing a boot would be inconvenient. Losing yourself because you insisted on keeping both boots spotless was considerably worse. The first hours passed peacefully. Dragonflies skimmed over, still pools like tiny jeweled arrows. Herons stood so motionless they resembled carved statues awaiting forgotten ceremonies. Frogs occasionally leaped into the water with dramatic splashes that startled absolutely everyone, except the frogs themselves. One particularly ambitious frog landed squarely on his satchel before realizing its mistake. The frog looked offended. The traveler apologized. The frog departed without accepting the apology. Negotiations had clearly failed. As the sun climbed higher behind a veil of cloud, he began noticing small details that did not belong. Here and there, smooth stones rested beneath shallow water, not unusual by themselves. But these stones shared identical shapes, flat, rectangular. Their edges remained surprisingly straight, despite centuries beneath mud and reeds. Nature was wonderfully creative. Perfect right angles were not among her favorite habits. He knelt beside one submerged slab and brushed away layers of silt. The stone bore faint grooves, not random scratches, tool marks. Someone had shaped this block long ago. Someone with patience. Someone building for generations rather than seasons. The villagers had not imagined everything. That much was already becoming clear. He continued deeper into the wetlands. The reeds gradually grew taller until they rose above his shoulders, forming narrow green corridors where even the wind seemed reluctant to enter. Birdsong diminished. The buzzing of insects became louder, then quieter, then absent altogether. Silence arrived so gradually that he only noticed it after several minutes. No buzzing, no splashing, no distant cries, only the gentle sound of his own footsteps disturbing shallow water. Even his breathing suddenly seemed impolite. He stopped walking. The silence remained. There are moments when quiet becomes a sound all its own. This was one of them. Then came another oddity. Footprints, fresh ones. He crouched carefully. The impressions were human, or nearly so. Bare feet, long toes, deep heels. They crossed a patch of damp earth before disappearing into water, no deeper than his ankles. He followed them several paces. Then they simply ended. No return trail, no disturbance ahead, only smooth water reflecting pale clouds. He stared for a long moment. Perhaps whoever made them had stepped onto hidden stones. Perhaps the marsh enjoyed unfinished conversations. He decided against inventing explanations too quickly. Old places deserved patience. By midday, he reached a narrow island no larger than a village square. Twisted birch trees grew there, their pale trunks bending like elderly scholars leaning over forgotten manuscripts. Among their roots stood several weathered stones arranged in a rough circle. Not graves, markers. Each stone carried faint carvings nearly erased by time. He brushed moss away with careful fingers. The symbols were unfamiliar. Loops, interlocking lines, small crowns, a bird unlike any he recognized. At the center lay a shallow basin carved directly into stone. Rainwater had collected inside it. Floating upon the surface was a single white feather, perfectly dry. He blinked. The basin had no cover. Rain had certainly fallen during the night, yet the feather looked untouched, light enough that even a whisper of moisture should have ruined it. He reached toward it. A breeze swept across the island. The feather lifted effortlessly into the air. It circled him once, twice, then drifted away into the reeds. Well, that was either deeply meaningful, or the feather simply had a better sense of timing than most people. He preferred not to argue with either possibility. An eccentric bit of old knowledge came to mind. Some medieval marsh communities believed birds carried messages between the living and places forgotten by maps. White feathers, in particular, were sometimes considered invitations rather than omens. Invitations to what varied considerably. That was the inconvenient part. He ate a simple meal of bread, dried cheese, and smoked fish while sitting beneath one of the birches. Nothing tastes quite as satisfying as ordinary food after several hours of wondering whether the ground intends to become liquid. Refreshed, he pressed onward. The marsh subtly changed. Pools became clearer. The water, once dark with peat, now reflected the sky almost perfectly. Small fish darted between waving strands of underwater grass. Then he noticed something impossible. Straight beneath the crystal-clear water lay another worked stone. Then another. Then another. They formed a line. He stepped carefully alongside them. The stones continued forward, not scattered, ordered. His heartbeat quickened. He pushed aside reeds. The line widened. One row became two. Two became several. The outline of a road slowly emerged beneath the water, hidden beneath centuries of gentle silence. The paving stones stretched onward into the mist, disappearing beyond sight. Not a village path, not a shepherd's crossing, a true road, broad enough for carts, built with astonishing precision. Ancient engineers had raised it slightly above the marsh floor, though time had allowed water to reclaim it. He stood motionless. The villagers had spoken of roads appearing beneath shallow water. He had assumed exaggeration. Instead, the truth seemed almost modest compared to reality. Then something caught his eye farther ahead. A shape, low, grey, angular, barely visible through drifting mist. It might have been another cluster of stones, or perhaps part of a wall. He could not yet tell. The road continued directly toward it. Without realizing it, he had stopped looking for the Forgotten Kingdom. Now it seemed the Forgotten Kingdom had begun revealing itself instead. The road beneath the water drew him onward with a quiet certainty that no signpost could ever match. Its stones remained astonishingly even, despite the centuries that had passed. Here and there, soft green moss filled the narrow gaps between the paving blocks, while delicate strands of watergrass waved gently across their surface like long-forgotten banners greeting the occasional visitor. He stepped carefully from one stone to the next. The water rarely climbed above his ankles now. Whether by remarkable engineering or simple fortune, the ancient builders had raised the causeway, just enough that it resisted the marsh's endless attempts to erase it completely. The traveler paused once to look behind him. Already the mist had swallowed the path he had walked. Only the road ahead remained visible. He laughed quietly to himself. "Well," he muttered, That's wonderfully encouraging. There is something deeply unsettling about a road that politely removes the possibility of second thoughts. Still, turning back hardly seemed easier. The causeway stretched forward through curtains of silver mist, disappearing and reappearing as the breeze shifted. Every few minutes, another stretch revealed itself, almost as though the marsh were deciding how much it wished him to see. He noticed that the reeds had begun to thin. Instead of dense walls of green, scattered patches now stood like lonely sentries. Small willow trees emerged from shallow pools, their branches trailing across the water's surface. Birdsong returned, but differently. These were not the cheerful calls he'd heard nearer the village. Their notes were slower, measured, almost ceremonial. One bird repeated the same 3 tones over and over, pausing between each call as though waiting for an answer that never arrived. He could not identify the species. Perhaps no one could anymore. After another half hour, the road widened. Along its edges stood low stone posts, most toppled into the water. Each had once supported something larger. Lanterns, perhaps, carved statues, decorative columns. Whatever had crowned them had long since vanished. One post still stood upright. Its face bore an elegant carving of intertwined reeds surrounding a crown. Simple, graceful, remarkably well preserved. He brushed away a patch of moss. The craftsmanship spoke of confident hands. This had not been a poor frontier. Kingdom hastily assembled from necessity. Its people had invested beauty into objects travelers might barely notice, that often revealed more about a civilization than its palaces ever could. Nearby, he spotted something glinting beneath the water. He knelt and reached down. His fingers closed around a small bronze object coated in centuries of dark sediment. Carefully rubbing it clean against his sleeve revealed a tiny bell, no larger than a walnut. Its clapper had rusted away long ago. He turned it over in his palm. Delicate vines encircled its surface. The metalwork remained astonishingly detailed. It might once have hung from a horse's harness, or a child's toy, or perhaps from the robes of some forgotten official. Its purpose had disappeared with its owners. He slipped it into his satchel, not as treasure, as a memory. History deserved witnesses more than collectors. A curious bit of forgotten custom came to mind. In several medieval marshland communities, small bronze bells were sometimes tied to pack animals, not simply to locate them in fog, but because people believed the gentle ringing discouraged wandering spirits from following travelers home. Whether the bells truly frightened spirits was impossible to know. They certainly annoyed sleepy horses, which may have produced similar results. The road carried him onward. Gradually the marsh itself changed again. The water grew clearer still. Beneath its surface, he began noticing orderly shapes, straight lines, foundations, low walls, not natural formations, buildings, or what remained of them. Entire structures lay hidden beneath only a few feet of crystal water. Some roofs had collapsed inward centuries ago. Others remained astonishingly intact beneath blankets of algae. He stopped beside what had once been a cottage. A stone hearth still occupied one corner. Nearby rested what looked remarkably like a grinding stone. Everything remained exactly where its owners had left it. No fire, no battle, no hurried escape. Simply abandonment. It felt wrong somehow. Villages destroyed by war often displayed violence. Villages abandoned through famine carried signs of desperation. This place seemed paused, as though its people had stood up one afternoon intending to return before supper. They never had. The silence grew heavier. Even the wind seemed unwilling to disturb it. He continued. The causeway eventually climbed ever so slightly. The water retreated from its surface until his boots touched dry stone for the first time since entering the deeper marsh. He almost celebrated the simple pleasure of dry feet. Almost. The dry ground revealed something new, wheel ruts, ancient ones, still carved into the stone itself. Countless wagons had once traveled this very road. Merchants, farmers, messengers, children riding beside their parents. Perhaps impatient nobles complaining about bumps despite possessing considerably softer seats than everyone else. Some complaints truly are timeless. He followed the grooves until the mist ahead slowly began to unravel. At first, he saw only dark shapes, then outlines, then certainty, walls. Immense stone walls rose from the marsh like sleeping giants, awakening after centuries beneath a blanket of fog. Most towers had collapsed. Large sections leaned dangerously. Vines and moss claimed every surface. Yet enough remained to reveal breathtaking scale. This had not merely been a town, it had been a capital. The outer gate still stood. Its wooden doors had long since rotted away, leaving only enormous stone pillars framing the entrance. Above them, weathered carvings stretched across the arch. Kings, queens, no. As he squinted more carefully, he realized they depicted ordinary people. Farmers, boat builders, children carrying baskets, fishermen, craftsmen. No rulers stood above them. An unusual choice, a proud one. Whoever built this place wished visitors to remember the kingdom belonged first to its people. That alone intrigued him more than any forgotten crown. He approached slowly. The air itself seemed cooler here. Every sound echoed strangely between broken stones. Even his footsteps returned with faint delays, as though invisible travelers walked just behind him. He glanced over his shoulder. No one. Only mist drifting patiently along the road. As he passed beneath the towering gateway, sunlight briefly pierced the clouds overhead. Golden beams slipped through broken walls and reflected across flooded streets beyond. For one breathtaking moment, the ruined city seemed almost alive again. Windows shimmered. Columns glowed softly. The water mirrored forgotten buildings so perfectly that it became difficult to tell where the ancient kingdom ended and its reflection began. Then the clouds closed once more. The vision disappeared. Only silence remained. He stood within the forgotten kingdom at last. And somewhere, deep inside the drowned city, there came the faintest sound. Not a voice, not footsteps. A bell. One single clear note. Far too distant to locate. Far too gentle to fear. Yet unmistakably real. The little bronze bell, resting silently inside his satchel, gave no reply. But somehow, standing alone beneath those weathered gates, he found himself wondering whether the city had just welcomed him, or acknowledged that someone had finally come to listen. The sound of the distant bell faded so gently that he could not be certain he had heard it at all. He remained beneath the broken gateway, listening. Nothing, only the faint drip of water from ancient stone. A breeze wandered through the empty archway, carrying with it the cool scent of moss, old limestone, and marsh flowers, blooming somewhere beyond sight. The silence did not feel empty. It felt occupied, not by unseen figures lurking behind fallen walls, but by memory itself. Cities, he had long believed, possessed a kind of heartbeat. Even after people departed, something lingered. A marketplace remembered laughter. A workshop remembered labor. A chapel remembered whispered prayers. This place remembered an entire kingdom. He stepped forward. The gatehouse rose high above him, despite the damage centuries had inflicted upon it. Great blocks of pale stone remained fitted together with astonishing precision. Tiny plants sprouted from narrow cracks. Roots slipped patiently between the stones, performing the slow work that armies could never accomplish. Time always hired the smallest workers. Above the entrance, weathered carvings stretched across the arch. From a distance they had appeared simple. Up close, they revealed extraordinary detail. There were no triumphant kings riding enormous horses, no warriors dramatically waving swords toward conveniently placed sunsets. Instead, the sculptors had filled the arch with ordinary life. A baker kneaded dough. A woman carried bundles of reeds. Children chased geese through a square. Boat builders shaped planks. A physician examined a child's arm. An elderly storyteller sat beneath a tree while listeners crowded around him. The traveler smiled. Now that's refreshing. Most rulers preferred monuments featuring themselves looking considerably more impressive than reality ever allowed. These people had chosen something quieter, something kinder. Perhaps they had understood that kingdoms survived because of ordinary hands rather than jeweled crowns. He passed beneath the final stretch of shadow cast by the gatehouse. Beyond it lay a broad avenue, or rather, what remained of one. Smooth paving stones extended straight ahead beneath a thin layer of perfectly clear water. The buildings lining both sides leaned at odd angles, yet many still stood, 2 or even 3 stories tall. Their roofs had collapsed long ago. Window openings stared silently toward the empty streets. Wooden balconies had disappeared, leaving only sockets where beams once rested. Here and there, delicate carvings still decorated doorframes. Flowers, birds, intertwining vines. Nothing boastful, simply beautiful. Small silver fish drifted lazily through open doorways. One disappeared into what had once been someone's kitchen. He imagined a medieval cook reacting to fish swimming across the floor. Actually, given enough flooding, perhaps they would simply have added herbs and declared supper unusually cooperative. He walked slowly along the avenue. Every step felt like turning the pages of a forgotten book. A wagon wheel rested against one wall. Its wood had vanished centuries earlier. Only the iron rim remained. Nearby stood a stone bench polished smooth by generations of people who would never sit there again. On another corner, he found a public well. The circular stone surround remained perfectly intact. Curious, he peered inside. Instead of darkness, he found crystal clear water extending only a few feet downward before meeting solid stone. The well had filled from below. The marsh had risen until underground. Springs and city wells had become indistinguishable. Nature rarely hurried. It simply waited, then won. As he continued, more curious details appeared. Small carvings marked many buildings, a loaf of bread above one doorway, a pair of shears above another, a carved fish, a hammer, a tiny owl. Shop signs, simple enough that even travelers unable to read could understand them. He stopped before the doorway marked with the owl. Inside, shelves carved directly into the stone walls remained visible. Fragments of clay jars rested undisturbed upon the floor. Scattered across a long table lay dozens of tiny polished pebbles. Each had been carefully shaped into circles. Game pieces, perhaps. Counting stones. No one remained to explain them. An eccentric historical curiosity surfaced in his memory. Several medieval communities across Europe used carved stones instead of wooden tokens for board games in damp regions because stone resisted moisture far better than wood. It was a wonderfully practical solution. Unfortunately, stone pieces were considerably less forgiving if someone became a sore loser and decided to throw them. Some family disagreements must have ended with impressive accuracy. He left the little shop behind. Ahead, the avenue widened into what had once been a bustling square. The water here barely covered the paving stones. Sunlight filtered through drifting clouds, illuminating the entire plaza with soft silver light. At its center stood a fountain, or what had been one. Instead of water flowing upward, vines now spilled gracefully over its carved basin. The central statue remained remarkably intact. It depicted neither king nor warrior. It showed a woman holding a bundle of reeds in one arm while extending the other toward the city. Her expression was calm, welcoming. At the statue's feet rested carved birds and fish, symbols of the marsh itself, perhaps a queen, perhaps merely an ideal. He could not know. Around the square stood larger buildings. One possessed broad steps leading upward between elegant columns. Another displayed long rows of tall windows. A third featured elaborate stone arches surrounding an open courtyard. The architecture suggested confidence without extravagance. The builders had clearly valued proportion more than excess. The traveler sat upon the edge of the fountain. For several long moments, he simply listened. The city responded with almost nothing. A distant splash, wind brushing reeds beyond the walls, the occasional flutter of wings. Yet beneath those ordinary sounds lingered another sensation, expectation, as though the city itself had paused politely, waiting to see what kind of guest he intended to be. Not every explorer arrived seeking understanding. Many sought treasure, others sought glory. Some desired proof that legends belonged to them now. He wanted only the story. Perhaps that mattered. As afternoon drifted toward evening, golden light began slipping through gaps in broken rooftops. The reflections transformed flooded streets into ribbons of liquid amber. Long shadows stretched across the square. The entire city seemed to breathe more slowly. Then he noticed them. Far across the plaza, flanking another enormous avenue, stood two colossal statues. Unlike every carving he had seen so far, these figures were not ordinary citizens. They wore long ceremonial robes. Their faces were serene. Each rested both hands upon the top of a tall staff. No crowns adorned their heads. Instead, reeds were woven into intricate circlets around their brows. Though stained by centuries of weather, both statues remained almost perfectly preserved. They faced one another across the road, as though guarding everything beyond, or perhaps welcoming only those willing to pass between them. The distant bell rang again, one clear note. This time it echoed through the empty streets, neither louder nor softer than before, simply closer. The traveler rose from the fountain's edge. His boots disturbed the shallow water with quiet ripples. Without quite deciding to do so, he found himself walking toward the silent gatekeepers, whose patient stone eyes had watched over the forgotten kingdom for longer than any living soul could remember. The two colossal statues seemed larger with every step. From the fountain, they had appeared impressive. Standing before them, they became almost overwhelming. Each rose nearly 3 times the height of a man, carved from pale stone that had weathered into soft shades of gray and green. Moss traced delicate lines along their robes, while slender vines wrapped around the staffs they held with calm, unmoving hands. Neither figure looked stern. Neither appeared welcoming. Instead, they wore expressions of remarkable patience, the kind of patience found in mountains, or old trees, or grandparents listening to children explain something they already knew 50 years ago. The traveler slowed as he approached. The broad avenue between the statues remained almost perfectly dry, though flooded streets surrounded it on either side. The paving stones here had been laid with extraordinary care, forming subtle ridges that directed water away toward narrow channels. Even abandoned for centuries, the engineering continued doing its work. That alone inspired quiet admiration. Many kingdoms struggled to maintain roads while they still possessed taxpayers. These builders had apparently planned for several hundred years of neglect. He passed between the statues. Nothing happened. No hidden doors opened. No mysterious voices echoed from the sky. No dramatic burst of ancient magic announced his arrival. History, he reflected, usually preferred quieter entrances. Still, the air beyond the statues felt different, cooler. The faint scent of marsh flowers gave way to something drier. Old stone, dust, ancient timber. Impossible, perhaps, after centuries of abandonment, yet unmistakable. The avenue climbed gently toward the heart of the city. Buildings became larger. Their carved facades displayed increasingly intricate designs, interwoven reeds, birds taking flight, curling vines, flowing water, and countless geometric patterns that repeated with mathematical precision. He noticed something else. No building towered above the others, by very much. Even the grandest structures seemed intentionally restrained. The city had been built with balance, rather than domination in mind. It was an unusual choice. Many rulers liked reminding everyone exactly where they lived, preferably by constructing something visible from several neighboring countries. Here, grandeur appeared shared. The traveler smiled. Perhaps the kingdom's greatest display of confidence had been its lack of vanity. The avenue eventually opened into an enormous courtyard. Colonnades surrounded it on every side. Many columns had fallen, yet dozens remained standing, their reflections stretching into shallow pools that shimmered beneath the afternoon light. At the center stood a circular platform of polished stone, empty now. He climbed the low steps. The surface bore faint grooves radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. Thousands of feet had once crossed this place. Public announcements, ceremonies, festivals. He imagined musicians filling the square with lively tunes, while merchants argued cheerfully over prices, children weaving through the crowd, dogs enthusiastically pursuing entirely unrelated objectives. Every medieval gathering, regardless of location, seemed eventually to involve someone chasing poultry. Civilization had its constants. A gentle breeze stirred across the courtyard. For a brief moment, he thought he heard laughter. Not clearly, more like an echo remembered by stone. It vanished before he could be certain. He continued onward. Beyond the courtyard rose the largest structure he had yet encountered. Its broad staircase remained astonishingly intact, despite the years. Tall pillars framed an immense entrance whose bronze doors had disappeared long ago, leaving only dark openings leading within. Above the lintel stretched an elaborate relief unlike anything else in the city. Hundreds of figures had been carved together. Farmers, craftsmen, boat builders, children, elders, musicians, scholars. At the very center stood no monarch. Instead, an empty chair. He frowned thoughtfully. An empty throne, deliberately carved. That was no accident. He stepped closer. Along the base of the relief ran a weathered inscription in the same looping script he had seen upon the standing stones outside the city. He could not read a single symbol. Yet he traced the grooves gently with his fingertips. Letters survived long after voices vanished. Sometimes they waited centuries for someone who could understand them again. Inside, the building opened into an immense hall. Sunlight poured through gaps in the collapsed roof, illuminating drifting dust and narrow pools of rainwater. Rows of columns stretched into the distance. Fragments of painted plaster still clung to sections of the walls. Soft blues, deep greens, touches of faded gold. Enough remained to suggest breathtaking beauty before time had quietly repainted everything in gentler colors. The silence here felt different from the streets outside. Denser, respectful. He walked carefully between fallen stones. Broken benches lined the hall. Some had toppled, others remained neatly arranged. Nothing suggested panic. Nothing hinted at battle. Even after centuries, order lingered. Near the far end stood a raised platform, not quite a throne, not quite a stage. Its polished stone surface remained almost untouched. Behind it rose a great circular carving covering the entire wall. The design stopped him where he stood. It showed the marsh itself, not as a place of danger, as a living circle. Reeds, birds, fish, boats, people, rain, rivers flowing inward and outward, every part connected. At the very center stood the same empty chair, surrounded, not occupied. The symbolism puzzled him. Then an eccentric historical thought surfaced. Some medieval communities held ceremonial seats that represented the authority of law itself rather than any individual ruler. During certain gatherings, the chair remained empty to remind everyone that leaders served the realm, not the other way around. Few kingdoms actually managed to live by such ideals. Many certainly enjoyed carving them into walls. Still, this city felt unusually sincere. He circled the platform slowly. Near one corner lay something half hidden beneath centuries of dust. A narrow staff carved from dark wood. Impossible. Wood should not have survived so long. Yet here it rested. He knelt. The surface felt smooth, not brittle. Its top had been carved into the shape of intertwined reeds. No jewels, no precious metals. Simple craftsmanship. He hesitated before touching it again. The distant bell rang. One single note. This time it echoed through the great hall itself. The sound lingered beneath the broken roof long after it should have faded. Then, a second sound answered it. Not another bell. A soft tap, like the careful strike of a wooden staff against stone. Once, somewhere deeper inside the building. The traveler slowly stood. His eyes searched the long shadows between the columns. Nothing moved. No birds, no drifting vines. Only sunlight stretching quietly across the ancient floor. Then came the tap again. Closer, measured, patient. Not the sound of a collapsing ruin. Not the settling of old stone. It carried unmistakable intention. Someone, or something, was walking within the forgotten kingdom. The sound came again. Tap. A long pause. Tap. It echoed gently through the vast hall, softened by broken columns and the open roof above. It was not hurried, nor was it hidden. Whoever, or whatever, made the sound moved with the calm confidence of someone who had no reason to fear being discovered. The traveler remained perfectly still. Years spent wandering had taught him one valuable lesson. When entering an unfamiliar place, it was often wise to let the place make the next move. The tapping continued, slowly, steadily. It seemed to drift from somewhere beyond the circular chamber, deeper within the enormous building. He glanced once more at the carved wooden staff lying on the floor. It had not moved. At least, he was fairly certain it had not. After spending several days surrounded by mist and reflections, certainty had become a rather expensive luxury. Carefully, he left the staff where it rested. Not everything ancient wished to become a souvenir. Some objects belonged exactly where time had left them. He followed the sound. Beyond the great hall, a wide passage stretched into shadow. Sunlight filtered through narrow openings high in the walls, creating bright columns of light filled with floating dust. His footsteps sounded unusually soft here. The polished stone floor had survived remarkably well. Occasionally, he noticed faint patterns carved into the paving stones beneath his boots. Concentric circles, flowing water, tiny fish. Every design returned to the same quiet theme: life connected to the marsh. It became increasingly clear that this kingdom had not viewed the wetlands as an enemy. They had embraced them. Perhaps that explained why they had built here in the first place. The corridor opened into a sequence of smaller chambers. The first appeared to have been a meeting room. Stone benches lined the walls. At the center stood a circular table carved from a single enormous slab. No chairs surrounded it. Everyone seated upon the benches would have faced one another equally. No privileged position, no obvious seat of honor. Curious. The second chamber contained shelves, hundreds of them, most now empty. Fragments of broken clay tablets lay scattered across the floor. Rolled parchments had long since vanished. Only their bronze storage tubes remained. The traveler picked one up carefully. Green with age, beautifully engraved. He imagined scribes once hurrying through these rooms, carrying records of harvests, marriages, river levels, taxes, trade agreements, and countless ordinary matters that quietly held kingdoms together. History often remembered battles. It rarely remembered bookkeeping. Yet bookkeeping usually kept people fed. A light chuckle escaped him. Somewhere, an ancient accountant would probably be deeply offended that future generations admired the architecture while ignoring several exceptionally organized ledgers. The tapping stopped. Complete silence returned. He waited. Nothing. Then, faintly, the distant bell, one single clear tone. This time it seemed less like a warning, more like a guide. He continued onward. The next chamber stole his breath. Its walls remained almost completely covered with painted murals. Though faded, their colors survived remarkably well in the cool interior. Scenes unfolded one after another around the room. Children learning to weave reeds, farmers harvesting grain, builders raising bridges across shallow water, musicians performing during festivals, boats carrying goods through winding channels. No wars, no conquests, no triumphal processions, only life. Ordinary, peaceful life. One mural especially caught his attention. It showed dozens of people gathered beside the marsh, beneath a full moon. Each carried a small lantern. They were placing floating lights upon the water. The lanterns drifted together until they resembled stars scattered across the marsh. An elderly figure stood nearby, holding a long staff decorated with reeds, not commanding, watching, guiding. An eccentric historical custom surfaced in his memory. Certain medieval marsh communities held annual ceremonies in which floating lamps honored both ancestors and waterways, thanking them for sustaining life through fishing, fertile soil, and safe passage. Whether this kingdom practiced something similar or had inspired those traditions, he could not tell. But the resemblance was striking. He lingered before the murals longer than intended. The people depicted there possessed remarkably expressive faces. The artists had cared about individuals. One young baker grinned while dusting flour across his apron. A fisherman laughed at something outside the frame. A child appeared far more interested in chasing a duck than participating in whatever ceremony surrounded him. Some things truly ignored the passing centuries. Children remained wonderfully committed to becoming distracted. As he turned to leave, sunlight shifted through an opening above. For one fleeting heartbeat, the painted lanterns seemed almost alive. Golden reflections shimmered across the wall. Then the light moved on. The illusion vanished. Beyond the mural chamber lay a narrow staircase descending below ground, or perhaps below what had once been ground. Cool air drifted upward, carrying the unmistakable scent of damp stone. Not unpleasant, simply old. He descended carefully. Each step remained solid beneath his weight. The builders had possessed extraordinary skill. Below waited another corridor, lower and narrower than those above. Here, the walls bore no paintings. Instead, countless names had been carved into the stone, thousands of them, neatly arranged, line after line, generation after generation. He could not read the language, yet the repetition spoke for itself. This was no list of rulers. There were too many, perhaps citizens, families, craft guilds, those who had contributed to the kingdom. Whatever the purpose, it honored many rather than few. He ran his fingers lightly across one row of weathered letters. Stone remembered what voices could not. Then, tap, very close now, just beyond the next archway. He rounded the corner quietly. The passage opened into a circular chamber, illuminated from above by a single shaft of afternoon sunlight. At its center stood a shallow pool so perfectly still that it reflected the ceiling like polished glass. Beside the pool rested another wooden staff, nearly identical to the one upstairs, except this one stood upright, leaning against nothing, perfectly balanced. The traveler froze, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The staff tipped forward. It struck the stone floor with one gentle sound. Tap. No invisible hand caught it. No breeze stirred the chamber. It simply fell. The echo faded into silence, and somewhere beyond the far doorway, deeper within the sacred heart of the forgotten kingdom, another soft tap answered in return. Someone else was still there, waiting. The answering tap lingered in the silence, long after the echo had faded. The traveler did not hurry. There are moments when rushing forward accomplishes little beyond proving to history that you were exceptionally enthusiastic about making poor decisions. Instead, he stood beside the fallen wooden staff and studied the circular chamber. The shallow pool at its center remained perfectly still. Not a single ripple disturbed its surface. The beam of afternoon. Sunlight pouring through the opening above illuminated tiny particles drifting lazily through the air, making the chamber seem suspended somewhere between the passing hours and forgotten centuries. He crouched beside the pool. Its water was astonishingly clear. He expected to see only a stone bottom. Instead, he found steps. Narrow steps descending beneath the surface. They vanished into darkness after only a few feet. The pool was not merely decorative. It concealed another passage. He resisted the urge to investigate immediately. One mystery at a time had served him well throughout his travels. He rose again and approached the far doorway from which the answering tap had come. Beyond it stretched another corridor, smaller than the grand halls above, yet carved with extraordinary care. Every few yards, niches had been built into the walls. Inside each rested a small stone bowl. Most were empty. A few still contained dried fragments of herbs that had somehow survived in the cool air. The faint scent lingered. Juniper, mint, something sweeter that he could not identify. Perhaps these had once been offerings, or perhaps they simply kept the underground chambers pleasantly fragrant. Medieval builders often understood practical comforts better than they received credit for. If one intended to spend hours beneath the earth, copying records or conducting ceremonies, a pleasant aroma probably improved everyone's mood. Certainly better than smelling damp boots all afternoon. He smiled quietly at the thought. Ahead, the corridor widened into a long gallery. Unlike the rooms above, this one contained no furniture, only statues, dozens of them. Each stood upon a low pedestal. Men, women, young, old, none larger than life, none dressed as monarchs. Instead, each carried the tools of ordinary work. A potter held a shaping paddle. A fisherman carried folded nets. A mason rested one hand upon a square block of stone. A healer cradled a bundle of herbs. A child hugged an oversized goose that looked considerably less pleased about the arrangement. He could not help laughing softly. Apparently, medieval sculptors appreciated stubborn geese just as much as everyone else. The craftsmanship astonished him. Every face possessed its own character. Wrinkles gathered around smiling eyes. Hands bore the roughness of labor. Clothing folded naturally. These were portraits, real people, remembered not for conquering kingdoms, but for simply belonging to one. At the end of the gallery stood a larger figure, not a king, not a queen, an elderly woman. She wore plain robes. One hand rested upon a walking staff woven with carved reeds. The other extended outward with an open palm, an invitation, or perhaps a blessing. Carved around her feet grew lilies emerging from marsh water. The traveler bowed his head almost instinctively, not from worship, from respect. There was something profoundly moving about. A civilization that immortalized wisdom rather than power. An eccentric historical detail surfaced in his memory. Several lesser-known medieval communities occasionally elected respected elders, sometimes women, sometimes men, to oversee disputes because long experience was valued above noble birth. Though such traditions rarely survived the ambitions of larger kingdoms, scattered records suggested they had once been more common than people imagined. Perhaps this forgotten realm had embraced similar ideals. If so, its uniqueness extended far beyond architecture. He continued onward. Beyond the gallery lay a chamber unlike any he had yet encountered. The walls were lined with shallow alcoves. Inside each rested carefully arranged objects: a child's carved wooden bird, a woven reed bracelet, a tiny clay cup, fishing hooks, spindles, writing tools, simple belongings, none made of gold, none encrusted with jewels. The collection resembled memories. He approached one alcove. A small bronze needle rested beside a length of faded blue thread. Another contained a smooth river stone painted with tiny white dots. One displayed a pair of worn leather sandals, scarcely larger than those of a child. Nothing about the room suggested wealth. Everything suggested affection. Each object had been placed deliberately, preserved because someone had mattered. He felt suddenly reluctant to touch anything. The silence here carried tenderness rather than sorrow. Then he noticed inscriptions beneath every alcove. Again, the looping script. Again, unreadable. Names, perhaps. Families, stories. A great archive not of rulers, but of lives. History recorded from the ground upward instead of the throne downward. He wondered how many kingdoms had vanished because no one considered ordinary people important enough to remember. This one had done the opposite. And yet, it too had disappeared. Outside, somewhere high above, thunder murmured softly across the marsh. Rain was approaching. The shaft of sunlight entering through narrow ceiling openings dimmed. The underground chambers grew cooler. A faint breeze stirred. Not enough to extinguish a candle, enough to make him turn. At the far end of the room stood another doorway. It had been empty a heartbeat earlier. Now, someone stood there. An old figure, tall, wrapped in simple gray robes. A long wooden staff rested lightly in one hand. The same reed carving adorned its top. The figure did not move. Neither did the traveler. The distance between them remained too great for details. Only outlines emerged in the dim light. No threatening posture, no raised weapon, only quiet observation. Several long moments passed. Finally, the old figure inclined its head ever so slightly. Not quite a bow, more an acknowledgement. The traveler returned the gesture. It seemed the only proper response. The figure turned, without haste, without looking back, and disappeared into the darkness beyond the doorway. The traveler reached the entrance only seconds later. Beyond lay another corridor, empty, no side passages, no open doors, no sound of retreating footsteps, only silence. He looked down. The stone floor bore a thin layer of centuries-old dust. Across it stretched a single line of fresh footprints, bare feet, long toes, deep heels, the same mysterious tracks he had found far out in the marsh. They continued ahead for several yards, then simply stopped, not faded, not turned aside. Stopped, as though whoever had made them had quietly stepped out of the world itself. The traveler stared at the final footprint, then slowly lifted his eyes toward the darkness, waiting ahead. For the first time since entering the Forgotten Kingdom, he no longer felt like an explorer searching abandoned ruins. He felt like a guest who had finally been noticed by the last host, still keeping watch. The final footprint remained before him like the last word of a sentence whose beginning had been lost centuries earlier. He did not attempt to step into it. Some paths invited company, others deserved distance. The corridor beyond stretched quietly into darkness, interrupted only by occasional shafts of pale light filtering through narrow vents high above. The air remained cool and dry, carrying none of the damp heaviness he had expected beneath a drowned city. Someone had designed these passages remarkably well. Fresh air still found its way underground after all these years. The traveler wondered how many generations of careful builders had labored beneath the marsh, carving channels no visitor would ever admire. Engineers rarely became legends. Their bridges did. Their roads did. Their drainage systems quietly prevented everyone else from becoming very unhappy. It was the sort of thankless success that history seldom celebrated. He followed the corridor. Every few dozen steps, another carved niche appeared, each holding a small oil lamp fashioned from polished stone. Their wicks had long since vanished, but a faint scent of old herbs still lingered around them. Someone had once walked these halls carrying light. That thought comforted him more than he expected. Eventually, the passage curved gently to the left. The silence changed, not louder, fuller. He could hear water somewhere nearby, not rushing, not dripping, flowing, slowly, patiently. He emerged into a vast underground chamber. Its ceiling disappeared into shadow above. Massive stone columns rose like the trunks of an ancient forest, their reflections shimmering in a broad underground canal that crossed the room from one side to the other. The water moved almost imperceptibly, clear enough to reveal smooth stones lining its bottom. Bridges arched gracefully across the canal, each carved from single blocks of pale limestone. He stopped in admiration. The Forgotten Kingdom had not merely survived beside the marsh. It had lived with it. Water had been welcomed, guided, respected, not fought. An eccentric historical curiosity drifted into his thoughts. Some medieval settlements built intricate water management systems using gravity alone, directing fresh water through underground channels that required no pumps whatsoever. Visitors often admired castles while completely overlooking the astonishing engineering hidden beneath their feet. Human nature, he supposed. People noticed towers. Water noticed foundations. Crossing the nearest bridge, he observed delicate carvings running along the stone railing. Tiny fish swam between reeds. Water birds spread graceful wings. Children floated miniature boats. The artwork celebrated everyday harmony rather than heroic conquest. Even here, underground, beauty had been considered worthwhile. Halfway across the bridge, he paused. Something reflected in the water below. Not his own face. Another. He looked up immediately. No one stood nearby. Looking down again, he found only his own reflection rippling gently across the surface. He smiled to himself. Either the city enjoys jokes, he whispered, or I'm becoming considerably easier to surprise. The canal continued beneath a series of elegant arches before disappearing into darkness. Following it, he reached another chamber. Unlike the solemn galleries before, this room felt almost lived in. Low stone tables remained neatly arranged. Clay bowls rested upon shelves. Bundles of dried reeds hung from ceiling beams that somehow still endured. Someone had swept the floor. Recently. The dust lay undisturbed everywhere else throughout the city. Not here. His heartbeat quickened. He examined the nearest table. Upon it rested a woven basket. Inside lay fresh herbs. Not centuries-old fragments. Fresh, juniper, sage, wild mint, recently gathered. Beside them stood a small clay cup half filled with clear water. No layer of dust covered its rim. Someone had used it within the last day, or perhaps the last hour. He suddenly became aware that he was no longer alone. Not through sight, through presence. The peculiar feeling arrived without warning. The way one sometimes realizes another traveler has entered a room before hearing their footsteps. He turned slowly. Across the chamber, standing beside another canal bridge, waited the elderly figure. This time there was no mist, no great distance, only quiet certainty. The old man leaned lightly upon his carved wooden staff. His grey robes were simple but immaculately clean. Long silver hair rested upon his shoulders. His beard reached almost to his chest, neatly braided with thin strands of dried reeds. His face bore countless wrinkles, yet none suggested bitterness. They looked instead like gentle maps drawn by years spent smiling more often than frowning. His eyes were extraordinary, calm, clear, steady. They carried the patient expression of someone who had watched many seasons come and go without ever feeling the need to hurry them. Neither man spoke. Several heartbeats passed. Then the old man smiled. It was not the smile of someone greeting a stranger. It was the smile of someone whose guest had finally arrived after an exceptionally long journey. He lifted one hand from the staff and motioned gently for the traveler to follow. No command, only invitation. The traveler inclined his head. "I've been looking for this kingdom." The old man chuckled softly. His voice, when it came, was warm and surprisingly strong. "No," the traveler blinked. "No? You were looking for a story." The words settled comfortably between them. After a moment, the traveler found himself smiling as well. "Perhaps I was." The old man nodded. "Stories are often kinder guides than maps." He turned and began walking. His bare feet made almost no sound upon the stone. The traveler followed at a respectful distance. They crossed another bridge, passed beneath elegant arches, moved through chambers whose purpose he could only guess. At last, they entered a circular room illuminated by shafts of late afternoon sunlight descending through cleverly concealed openings above. At its center stood a single wooden chair, plain, well-crafted, empty. Around it rested 12 stone seats arranged in a wide circle. No seat stood higher than another. The old man rested both hands upon his staff. "You have seen our streets." "Yes." "Our homes." "Yes." "Our halls." "Yes." The old man looked toward the empty chair. "You have seen everything except the reason we remained." The traveler followed his gaze. The empty chair suddenly seemed far more important than any throne could ever have been. Outside, far above, distant thunder rolled across the marsh. The old man smiled gently. "It has been many years," he said, "since anyone came willing to listen before asking questions." He placed one weathered hand upon the back of the empty chair. "I believe," he continued softly, "it is finally time for someone to remember us correctly." The old man's hand rested lightly upon the back of the empty chair. He did not sit, neither did he invite the traveler to do so. The chair remained exactly as it had likely remained for generations, unoccupied, quietly commanding attention without demanding it. The traveler studied it more carefully. It was beautifully made, though not ornate. The wood had darkened with age, polished smooth by countless careful hands rather than lavish decoration. Delicate carvings of reeds and flowing water traced the edges of its frame. No precious stones glittered from its surface. No symbols proclaimed royal authority. Its greatest distinction seemed to be its simplicity. The old man noticed his gaze. Many visitors expect disappointment when they first see it. "I expected," the traveler admitted, "something grander." "Most do." The old man smiled, not mockingly, but with the patience of someone who had answered the same question many times. And then, they usually begin to understand. Silence settled comfortably between them. At length, the traveler asked the question that had quietly followed him since entering the city. "Who are you?" The old man rested both hands atop his carved staff. I was once called Edrin. The name seemed strangely familiar, though the traveler could not remember why. I am, the old man continued, the last keeper. The last keeper. Titles become smaller when there is no one left to impress. A faint smile crossed the traveler's face. I suppose they do. Edrin nodded toward the empty chair. My duty was never to rule. It was to remember. The traveler frowned thoughtfully. Remember what? Everyone. The single word carried remarkable weight. Edrin slowly walked around the circle of stone seats. The kings were remembered. The queens were remembered. The builders, the fishers, the children, the women who baked bread before sunrise, the old men who repaired boats. No one thanked them for repairing. The healer who knew which marsh herbs soothed fever. The girl who carved toys from willow branches. The boy who could imitate every bird in the marsh. He smiled faintly. He was quite annoying. The traveler laughed. I'm sure he was. He frightened fishermen by pretending to be rare birds. A terrible misuse of impressive talent. They shared another quiet laugh. The enormous chamber somehow felt warmer, not because of sunlight, because of memory. Edrin continued. A kingdom survives only while its people remember one another. When memory fails, he gently touched the empty chair. Stones become ruins. The traveler looked around the chamber. Everything he had seen throughout the city suddenly seemed connected. The statues of craftsmen, the ordinary homes, the preserved belongings, the carved names. Nothing had celebrated power. Everything had celebrated people. You built a kingdom around memory. Edrin inclined his head. No, we built it around belonging. The distinction mattered. Outside, faint rain had begun falling. Tiny droplets tapped softly against distant stone openings above. The sound drifted gently through the chamber like quiet applause. The traveler found himself asking another question. What happened? Edrin remained silent for several moments, not because he hesitated, because some stories deserved careful beginnings. The marsh gave us life. It gave fish, water, rich soil, safe travel. We learned its seasons. We respected its moods. For centuries. He smiled faintly. We believed respect would always be enough. His expression grew thoughtful. Then came 3 unusually wet years. Not storms, not disasters, simply rain. More rain than our canals had ever known. Our reservoirs filled, our fields flooded. The rivers refused to return to their banks. The traveler listened quietly. No armies? No invasion? No plague? Edrin shook his head. No, only water. There is something strangely humbling, he added softly, about discovering that the greatest enemy in history was never angry. It simply kept flowing. An eccentric historical curiosity surfaced in the traveler's thoughts. Entire medieval communities had occasionally relocated over decades rather than overnight as changing rivers, silting harbors, or expanding marshlands slowly made their homes impractical. Such disappearances rarely became famous because they lacked dramatic battles. History often overlooked quiet endings. Edrin seemed almost to hear the thought. People imagine kingdoms vanish with fire. They more often vanish with patience. The rain above intensified slightly. Its rhythm remained soothing, gentle, steady. The old keeper continued walking. We argued. Of course we argued. He chuckled. Humans remain wonderfully committed to believing someone else caused the weather. The traveler laughed again. I've met villages exactly like that. So have I. Edrin's eyes twinkled, though mine happened considerably longer ago. Eventually, the laughter faded. We faced a choice. We could abandon the city immediately, or remain while strengthening our waterways?" "What did you choose?" the traveler asked. "We chose both." He looked toward the empty chair. "Some families departed. Others stayed. No one was forced. No gates were closed. No roads were guarded. The kingdom ended, without becoming enemies of itself." The traveler absorbed the words in silence. It seemed almost impossible. A kingdom choosing kindness over desperation. Surely there had been conflict. Surely there had been selfishness. Edrin smiled knowingly. Oh, there were arguments. There were stubborn people. There was one baker who insisted his oven occupied the only dry ground in existence. The fishermen across the canal disagreed. For 12 years. 12? 12. Remarkable dedication. They eventually solved the dispute. How? The oven flooded. The traveler laughed so suddenly that his voice echoed around the chamber. Even Edrin laughed quietly. I imagine neither man enjoyed that solution. They complained together afterward. It improved their friendship considerably. The rain gradually softened. Light filtered once more through the openings above, illuminating the empty chair. Golden reflections danced across its polished wood. Edrin looked at it with unmistakable affection. When the last families departed, someone asked who would remain. You volunteered? No, I was volunteered. He sighed dramatically. It appears that spending one's youth remembering everyone's birthdays eventually creates unfortunate career opportunities. The traveler grinned. An unusual qualification. It seemed convincing at the time. The chamber grew peaceful once more. Far away, somewhere within the flooded city, a single bronze bell rang softly. One clear note. Neither man reacted with surprise. The traveler finally understood. The sound had never summoned him. It had simply marked the passing hours, keeping time, as it always had. Even after the kingdom itself had quietly slipped into legend. The bell's gentle tone drifted through the underground chamber until even its echo settled into silence. Edrin smiled faintly. It still keeps the hours. The traveler glanced toward the distant passage from which the sound had come. Who rings it? The old keeper's eyes sparkled with quiet amusement. Gravity. The traveler blinked. Gravity? Edrin nodded. Our bell tower. No longer stands above the city, but part of its mechanism survives below. He gestured patiently with his staff. Long ago, water flowing through underground channels turned a small wheel. The wheel lifted a hammer. When enough water gathered, the hammer fell. He paused. The marsh has been keeping our time ever since. The traveler laughed softly. So the kingdom's oldest servant is a stream. A remarkably dependable one. I've met nobles with considerably poorer punctuality. So have I. For a while, they simply listened. Somewhere beyond the walls, ancient water continued its patient journey through channels carved by forgotten hands. It neither celebrated nor mourned. It simply flowed. Edrin began walking once more, and the traveler followed. They climbed a gently sloping passage that gradually returned them toward the upper levels of the city. As they emerged into the afternoon light, the rain had ended. The flooded streets shimmered beneath a clearing sky. Tiny droplets clung to reeds growing between broken stones, catching the sunlight like countless small stars. The city looked almost refreshed, as though it had enjoyed the rain rather than endured it. They wandered without hurry. Now that he walked beside someone who had once lived here, the ruins transformed completely. What was this building? The traveler asked, pointing toward a long structure whose roof had collapsed inward. The cloth market. And that one? A bakery. It always smelled wonderful. Edrin smiled wistfully. The baker believed cinnamon improved absolutely everything. Did it? No. But he remained optimistic. They passed a broad courtyard. Children had once played there, Edrin explained. He described races around the fountain, winter games when rare frosts hardened the ground, summer evenings filled with music, a girl who climbed every tree despite repeatedly promising her mother she would not, a boy who accidentally released 36 ducks during an autumn festival. The ducks won, Edrin concluded. I assume they usually do. They were magnificent. The traveler could almost hear the laughter. The city no longer felt empty. Every street now carried invisible companions, ordinary people whose lives had quietly shaped every stone. An eccentric historical observation came to mind. Many medieval towns held annual fairs where musicians, storytellers, merchants, and craftsmen gathered from surrounding regions. Such festivals often mattered more to ordinary people than royal ceremonies ever did, creating memories that families carried across generations. Edrin nodded as though hearing the thought. Our midsummer gatherings lasted 3 days. Only 3? The 4th day everyone needed sleep. Even the ducks? Especially the ducks. They both laughed. The sound echoed pleasantly through the quiet streets. Eventually they reached the great central fountain once again. Water lilies now floated peacefully across its basin. The statue of the woman holding reeds watched silently over the square. The traveler looked toward her. Who was she? Edrin followed his gaze. No one knows. No one? We argued about that for generations. The traveler looked surprised. You forgot? We remembered the story. He smiled. Not the name. He rested both hands upon his staff. Some believed she represented the first settler. Others said she symbolized the marsh itself. My grandmother insisted she looked exactly like her aunt. Did she? Not even slightly. The traveler laughed. Grandmothers possess remarkable confidence. They certainly do. Edrin looked fondly at the statue. In time, it stopped mattering. The traveler understood. Sometimes symbols became stronger precisely because they belonged to everyone. They continued toward the city's western edge. Here, the buildings stood lower. Gardens stretched between homes. Though wild now, traces of careful planning remained visible. Stone borders outlined flower beds. Fruit trees still bore small apples. Vines climbed weathered trellises. The gardens survived, the traveler observed. The marsh spared many. Edrin picked a single apple, small, slightly crooked. He handed it to the traveler. It was crisp, sweet, remarkably fresh. The traveler raised an eyebrow. I wasn't expecting fruit. Neither were the trees. They shared another quiet smile. Beyond the gardens, the city gradually blended back into the wetlands. Stone roads disappeared beneath shallow water. Reeds reclaimed old fields. Nature and craftsmanship intertwined so completely that neither seemed to dominate. The traveler looked across the endless marsh. It almost feels. He searched for the right word. Peaceful. It is. Edrin's answer came without hesitation. We feared the marsh for a time. Then we remembered. Remembered what? That it was never trying to punish us. He watched a heron glide gracefully across the water. It simply continued being itself. The bird landed silently among distant reeds. For several moments, neither man spoke. The breeze carried the scent of wet earth and wild mint. Dragonflies skimmed across mirrored pools. The afternoon slowly leaned toward evening. Finally, the traveler turned. If your people left peacefully, why remain alone? Edrin looked toward the city. His expression held neither sadness nor regret. Because someone needed to greet those who eventually came searching. For treasure? For truth. He smiled gently. Most searched for treasure. And what happened? They became disappointed. They found no gold? Oh, there was gold. The traveler looked surprised. There was? Yes, Edrin chuckled. It simply wasn't the sort they expected. The old keeper rested his hand upon the weathered stone of the fountain. They saw empty buildings. I saw neighbors. They counted ruins. I counted lives. He looked directly at the traveler. The greatest treasure we preserved was never buried beneath the marsh. The traveler waited. Edrin's smile widened, just enough to soften the lines of his weathered face. It was the memory that a kingdom can be measured by how gently its people lived together. The evening bell rang once more. Soft, clear, steady. Above them, swallows circled through the golden sky, as though the forgotten kingdom had never truly vanished at all. The swallows circled above the quiet city until they disappeared into the warm glow of the late afternoon. Their graceful flight reminded the traveler of something Edrin had said. A kingdom could disappear without truly being lost. Perhaps places vanished only when no one remained willing to remember them. They walked together through streets that no longer felt abandoned. The traveler had begun recognizing corners. The baker's square, the cloth market, the gardens, the little workshop with the carved owl above its doorway. Each place now carried invisible voices. The city had not become crowded. It had become familiar. Edrin stopped beside a narrow canal where reeds brushed gently against the ancient stone banks. Small fish darted lazily beneath the surface. The old keeper rested both hands upon his staff. "There is something I have not yet shown you." The traveler smiled. "I suspected as much." Edrin laughed softly. A storyteller should never reveal every chapter too early. They followed the canal westward. The buildings gradually became fewer until only scattered homes stood among flowering marsh grasses. Nature had reclaimed much of this district, though not with violence. The transition felt almost cooperative. Stone paths wandered into reeds. Garden walls cradled wildflowers. Young willow trees rooted themselves beside ancient doorways. Time had edited the city rather than erased it. Eventually they reached a low hill that rose gently above the surrounding wetlands. Unlike the rest of the city, this place remained completely dry. Dozens of smooth stone markers stood beneath old oak trees. None resembled grand monuments. Each was simple, each nearly identical. The traveler immediately understood. This is where they were buried. Edrin shook his head. No. The traveler looked puzzled. No. We buried very few people here. He gently touched one of the weathered stones. These are farewell markers. Farewell? When families left the kingdom, they gathered here one final evening. He smiled quietly. They planted a tree. They placed a stone. They shared a meal. And then, they walked away. The traveler slowly looked around. There were hundreds of markers, perhaps thousands. No names were carved upon them. Only a single symbol repeated again and again, a circle woven from reeds. He frowned thoughtfully. "Why no names?" Edrin answered almost immediately. "Because the people who left already carried them." The simplicity of the answer lingered between them. An eccentric historical curiosity came to the traveler's mind. In some medieval communities, farewell ceremonies for families moving away could be nearly as significant as weddings, especially when relocation meant crossing great distances. Neighbors often exchanged practical gifts instead of valuables, believing useful memories traveled farther than precious objects. He imagined families embracing one another beneath these very trees, children promising impossible visits, grandparents pretending not to cry, neighbors exchanging bread, seeds, tools, and stories. The sort of quiet courage history rarely recorded. A breeze stirred the oak branches overhead. Leaves whispered softly together. The sound resembled distant conversation. Edrin began walking among the stones. I knew nearly every family. I remember who laughed the loudest, who always arrived late, who insisted their goat understood philosophy. The traveler raised an eyebrow. Did it? No. The goat merely enjoyed chewing important documents. That has a similar effect. They both laughed. Edrin paused before one particular marker. My sister stood here. His voice remained calm. She wanted me to leave with her. You didn't. I couldn't. Because of your duty? The old keeper nodded. And because someone had to lock the bakery. The traveler blinked. The bakery? Edrin smiled. The baker forgot. He remembered his flour. He remembered his favorite spoon. He remembered 3 jars of honey. But he forgot to lock the front door. The traveler burst into laughter. So before becoming keeper of the kingdom, I became keeper of the bakery. I suspect history overlooked that title. History overlooks many important things. The laughter faded gently. Neither man hurried to fill the silence. The sun drifted lower. Golden light filtered through oak branches, scattering warm patterns across the weathered stones. The traveler noticed that birds nested comfortably among the trees. They showed no fear. A pair of robins hopped confidently across the grass between the markers. Life continued peacefully here. Nothing about the place felt haunted, only remembered. After some time, Edrin spoke again. Many who left promised they would return. Did they? A few. They brought children. Later, grandchildren. They walked these paths. They remembered. His smile grew softer. Eventually, no one came. The traveler looked toward him. You remained. I remained. Were you lonely? Edrin considered the question carefully. Sometimes. He watched the marsh shimmer beyond the hill, but loneliness is quieter when accompanied by purpose. The traveler reflected upon that. Purpose did not erase solitude. Perhaps it simply gave it gentler company. The old keeper reached inside his robe. From a small leather pouch, he withdrew a tiny object wrapped carefully in faded linen. He unfolded the cloth. Inside rested a simple bronze key. No jewels, no ornament. Years of careful handling had polished its edges smooth. Edrin placed it in the traveler's palm. The metal felt unexpectedly warm. What does it open? The old man chuckled. Nothing. The traveler looked confused. It once opened the council archives. The doors disappeared centuries ago. So why keep it? Because it reminds me that some things are worth protecting even after the locks are gone. The traveler slowly closed his fingers around the key. Its weight felt strangely comforting, not because of its value, because of its meaning. Far away, the evening bell sounded once more. Gentle, measured, faithful. Edrin turned toward the city. The marsh is rising again. The traveler looked across the flooded streets. The water had indeed climbed slightly along the lower avenues. Nothing dramatic, barely noticeable, yet unmistakable. The old keeper smiled peacefully. It is time. The traveler followed his gaze as the first thin ribbons of evening mist began curling once more between the ancient buildings, slowly reclaiming the forgotten kingdom with the same quiet patience that had preserved it for centuries. The first strands of evening mist drifted across the lower streets with such gentle determination that they resembled pale silk being drawn carefully over the city. Nothing about their arrival felt threatening. The marsh did not rush. It never had. It simply returned, as faithfully as the evening bell and the swallows overhead. The traveler stood beside Edrin on the hill of farewell markers, watching the white ribbons weave between ancient walls. It begins earlier each year? He asked. The old keeper nodded. A little, and a little higher. His voice carried no bitterness, only observation. The traveler looked back toward the city. From this distance, the flooded streets reflected the golden sky so perfectly that the kingdom appeared to float between two worlds. Stone above, light below. For a brief moment, it seemed impossible that anyone could ever lose such a place. Then the mist thickened slightly, softening the outlines of towers and rooftops. Even beauty, he thought, could become difficult to see if one waited too long. Edrin started down the gentle slope. We should walk. There is still time. They followed a winding stone path that curved through gardens, slowly surrendering to the marsh. The air smelled of wet grass, mint, and flowering reeds. Somewhere nearby, frogs had begun their evening chorus. Unlike the uneasy silence that had greeted the traveler days before, these sounds now felt like familiar neighbors exchanging greetings after a long day. The city itself seemed content. As they passed the old bakery, Edrin paused. The doorway still leaned slightly to one side. A weathered stone oven remained visible inside. The old keeper chuckled. I should check the lock. The traveler smiled. Just in case? You never know. He walked to the doorway with exaggerated seriousness, leaned forward, and gently tapped the old stone frame. There. Secure for another century. The traveler laughed. I admire your dedication. It has become a habit. Habits, Edrin replied, are simply promises that have grown comfortable. They continued walking. The mist reached their ankles now, cool and soft as morning dew. It drifted around fallen columns without disturbing the water. The traveler noticed that reflections had begun to blur. The city seemed less solid, not vanishing, simply becoming quieter. An eccentric historical thought surfaced. In many medieval communities, evening bells did more than mark the hour. They reminded travelers to seek shelter, merchants to close their stalls, and families to gather before darkness settled over the countryside. A bell could be less a command than a gentle invitation to return home. The traveler glanced toward the distant sound of the old mechanism still keeping time beneath the marsh. This kingdom had never truly stopped calling people home. Its definition of home had simply changed. As they crossed the central square once more, Edrin slowed beside the statue of the woman holding reeds. The mist curled around its base. Do you know, the traveler asked, what I think now? Edrin smiled. I have guesses. I think she was never meant to be one person. The old keeper raised an eyebrow. Oh? I think she became everyone. Edrin's smile broadened. I rather like that answer. So do I. They stood together for a while. No further explanation seemed necessary. Some truths improved when left uncomplicated. A flock of small birds settled upon the statue's shoulders. One perched confidently upon her outstretched hand. Even the birds treated her as though she belonged there. The mist climbed higher. Knees now. The lower streets disappeared beneath soft white waves. From somewhere within the city came the familiar bell. One clear note, then silence. Edrin looked toward the sound. It will soon be difficult to leave. The traveler understood. The causeway, the ancient road beneath the marsh. It would disappear once more beneath rising water. He looked at the bronze key still resting safely inside his satchel. So this is farewell. The old keeper considered the words. No, not farewell. He shook his head gently. Completion. The distinction felt important. They walked toward the great gate together. The enormous statues still stood patiently on either side of the avenue, their stone staffs wrapped in living vines. The traveler looked up at their serene faces. When I first arrived, he said, I thought they were guarding the city. And now? I think they were greeting those willing to enter with respect. Edrin nodded approvingly. Every gate reveals more about the traveler than the road. Outside the walls, the marsh stretched endlessly beneath the fading sky. The submerged causeway shimmered faintly through the shallow water. Already its distant sections were disappearing beneath fresh ripples. Time was growing short. The traveler turned back one last time. The city looked peaceful, not abandoned, not lonely, simply resting. He faced Edrin. Will anyone else find this place? The old keeper smiled. Perhaps. And if they do? That depends. On what? Whether they come searching for gold, he paused, or for understanding. The traveler reached into his satchel and removed the tiny bronze bell he had found upon the ancient road. I almost forgot. Edrin accepted it carefully. His weathered fingers traced the delicate carvings. A quiet laugh escaped him. I wondered where that had gone. It belonged here. It belonged to a child's satchel. The traveler blinked. You remember? I remember everything I can. The old keeper looked toward the city. He cried for 2 days. I suspect his mother comforted him. No. She told him to pay better attention. The traveler laughed. That also sounds like a mother. It certainly does. Edrin slipped the little bell into his robe. I believe he'll be pleased to have it back. The traveler hesitated. But he stopped. The child had been gone for centuries. Edrin understood without hearing the question. Memory, he said softly, is sometimes the longest form of returning something home. The evening breeze stirred. The mist thickened. Beyond the gate, the ancient road waited. Behind it, the forgotten kingdom grew quieter with every passing breath. The traveler lingered beneath the towering gateway for one final moment. Behind him, the city rested beneath a slowly deepening veil of mist. Ahead, the ancient causeway stretched across the marsh like a pale ribbon disappearing into the evening. Neither direction seemed entirely like leaving. Neither felt entirely like staying. The old keeper remained beside the weathered stone arch, his reed-carved staff resting lightly against the ground. You know, the traveler said quietly, when I first heard the stories, I expected to find a lost kingdom. Edrin smiled. And instead, I found one that simply stopped asking to be found. The keeper inclined his head. There is an important difference. The traveler nodded. He understood now. The kingdom had never hidden itself out of fear. It had merely accepted that every place has its season. Some cities become capitals, some become villages, some become stories. None of those endings were failures. They were simply different chapters. The mist drifted through the gate between them, soft as breath. For a few heartbeats, neither man spoke. Then Edrin gently tapped his staff upon the ancient stone. I have one request. The traveler looked at him. If you tell our story, I will. Do not make us greater than we were. The traveler frowned slightly. You deserve to be remembered. We do. The old keeper smiled warmly. But not as perfect people. He looked back toward the silent streets. We argued. We made mistakes. We forgot birthdays. We occasionally burned bread. There was an entire season during which our council spent 3 weeks debating the proper width of a fishing dock. The traveler chuckled. 3 weeks. The dock was built. Was it the correct width? No. They both laughed. It had to be rebuilt the following spring. The laughter echoed gently beneath the broken archway before dissolving into the evening air. Edrin's expression softened. Tell them we were ordinary. Because ordinary people built extraordinary kindness. The traveler committed every word to memory. I promise. The keeper seemed satisfied. Together they stepped onto the ancient causeway. Water lapped quietly against the edges of the smooth paving stones. The road that had appeared so mysterious on his arrival now felt strangely familiar. He recognized the carved boundary posts, the patches of moss, the gentle rise and fall of the ancient engineering beneath his boots. The marsh itself had changed as well. Or perhaps he had. Herons stood quietly among the reeds. Dragonflies skimmed across the still water. The frogs continued their evening chorus with remarkable confidence, apparently convinced they were the finest singers in creation. Perhaps they were. No audience had yet complained. Halfway along the causeway, Idrin stopped. "This is where I remain." The traveler looked around. The city still stood clearly behind them. The village lay hidden beyond layers of mist ahead. "You won't come farther?" The old keeper shook his head. "My road ends where yours continues." The simplicity of the answer carried no sadness, only acceptance. The traveler reached into his satchel. "I still have your key." "You do. It belongs with you." Edrin gently closed the traveler's hand around it. "No." The traveler looked surprised. "But you said—" "I said it opens nothing." He smiled. "It no longer belongs to a building. It belongs to the story." The bronze key felt unexpectedly heavy. "Keep it," Edrin continued, "so that whenever you doubt whether memory matters, you will have something weighty enough to disagree." The traveler laughed softly. "That sounds suspiciously like wisdom." "It is, which makes it suspicious." The keeper's eyes sparkled. "You've been paying attention." An eccentric historical reflection surfaced in the traveler's thoughts. Throughout the Middle Ages, keys often symbolized responsibility more than ownership. The keeper of a city's gate, granary, archive, or treasury was trusted not because the key was valuable, but because the community believed the person carrying it would use it wisely. Perhaps that symbolism had never truly disappeared. The wind shifted. The mist thickened around the stones. When the traveler looked toward the city again, its outlines had already begun softening into pale silhouettes. The great statues at the gate seemed farther away than moments before, not because they had moved, because the marsh had quietly resumed its patient work. Edrin watched the fading skyline with unmistakable affection. "I used to think I was protecting the kingdom." "Weren't you?" The old keeper smiled. "No. I was protecting its welcome." The traveler considered those words carefully. There was profound difference between guarding a place and preserving the spirit with which visitors arrived. One relied upon walls, the other upon kindness. A bell sounded, one clear note, then another. For the first time since entering the forgotten city, the mechanism rang twice instead of once. The traveler turned. "I've never heard two." Edrin listened quietly. "Neither have I." "What does it mean?" The keeper looked upward toward the darkening sky. "I imagine." He paused thoughtfully. "It means the marsh approves of company." The explanation was impossible. Naturally, it felt entirely appropriate. The traveler smiled. "I'll accept that." "So will I." The mist rose almost to their waists now. The distant city had become little more than silver shapes floating within a sea of white. Soon even those would disappear. The traveler took one slow breath, then another. "I suppose this really is completion." Edrin nodded. "It is." They stood together in companionable silence, watching the forgotten kingdom gently withdraw behind its timeless curtain of mist, not hiding from the world, but returning, with quiet dignity, to the patient care of the marsh that had sheltered it for so many generations. For a long while, neither man moved. The mist drifted around the ancient causeway, with the quiet confidence of something that had performed the same gentle task for centuries. It did not rush to hide the kingdom. It simply welcomed it home. The traveler watched as the highest rooftops slowly dissolved into silver haze. First, The lower walls disappeared, then the towers. Then the great gateway became only a faint suggestion against the evening sky. Finally, even the two patient stone guardians faded until they seemed no more substantial than memories. Only Edrin remained clearly beside him. The old keeper rested comfortably upon his staff. "There," he said softly. "It is sleeping again." The traveler found himself whispering in return. "Does it always feel like this?" "The first time." "And after that?" Edrin smiled. "You stopped saying goodbye." The words lingered gently. Perhaps that was the difference between losing something and understanding it. The traveler looked down at the bronze key resting in his hand. Its edges had warmed against his palm. An ordinary key, one that opened no door. Yet somehow, it now seemed capable of unlocking countless conversations. Not because of what it did, because of what it reminded people to ask. He slipped it carefully back into his satchel, not hidden, simply carried. A pair of swans glided silently across a nearby pool, their reflections stretching through the fading light. The marsh accepted them without a ripple. Edrin watched them pass. "They nest here every spring." "For centuries?" The keeper nodded. "Their grandparents were considerably noisier." The traveler laughed. "You knew their grandparents." "I knew everyone's grandparents." He paused thoughtfully. "Some were more polite than others." "I've noticed that applies equally well to swans and people." "It certainly does." Together they resumed walking along the causeway. Behind them, nothing remained visible but mist. Ahead, the first stars were beginning to appear above the marsh. The evening air carried the scent of damp reeds, cool earth, and distant wildflowers, closing their petals for the night. The traveler realized he no longer felt the urge to look back every few steps. The city had not vanished. It simply no longer required watching. That realization surprised him. Many travelers measured a journey by the places they reached. Perhaps wiser ones measured it by the worries they quietly left behind. An eccentric historical curiosity drifted into his thoughts. Some medieval pilgrims believed that returning from a sacred place carried as much importance as arriving. The journey home gave travelers time to understand what they had experienced, transforming distant roads into part of the lesson itself. Perhaps every meaningful road worked that way. After some time, Edrin slowed. "This is where you must continue alone." The traveler looked around. The causeway stretched onward into familiar reeds. The village still remained hidden by distance and evening mist. "You truly won't come farther." The old keeper smiled. "I already have." The traveler frowned. "You have?" "I walked farther today than I have in many years." He looked back toward the invisible city. Sometimes the distance worth measuring isn't counted in steps. The traveler understood. For someone who had remained behind for generations, accompanying another soul, even this far, had been its own remarkable journey. "I'll remember." "I know." Silence settled comfortably once more. No farewell speeches, no dramatic embraces. Neither seemed appropriate. Instead, Edrin reached into the sleeve of his robe and withdrew something very small. A tiny woven ring made from dried marsh reeds, hardly larger than a coin. He placed it gently into the traveler's hand. "It won't last forever." The traveler examined the delicate weaving. "It doesn't need to." The keeper nodded approvingly. "Exactly." The ring weighed almost nothing. Perhaps that was fitting. Not every meaningful gift required heaviness. The traveler carefully tucked it beside the bronze key. Metal and reeds, endurance and fragility, both carried memory in different ways. The evening bell sounded once more. Its note reached them faintly across the marsh. Then another answered. Not from the city, from somewhere much farther away. The traveler listened. "Another bell?" Edrin tilted his head. The village. The traveler smiled. The people there had no idea that their evening bell now answered one beneath the marsh. Perhaps it always had. Perhaps generations had unknowingly continued a conversation begun centuries earlier. The thought pleased him immensely. He imagined old fishermen hearing both bells without questioning them. Some mysteries, after all, became so familiar that no one remembered to find them strange. The breeze shifted again, cooler now. Night approached steadily. Edrin stepped back. The mist wrapped softly around his robes. "Go." The traveler hesitated. Then he bowed, not deeply, not ceremoniously, but with sincere respect. "Thank you." The old keeper returned the gesture. "Walk gently." The traveler turned toward the distant village. After several dozen steps, he looked back. Edrin still stood upon the ancient road, staff in hand, calm, patient, exactly as the traveler had first seen him. He raised one hand in quiet farewell. The keeper answered in the same simple way. Then a passing veil of mist drifted between them. When it moved on, the causeway stood empty. No footprints, no figure, only pale stones stretching silently across the water. The traveler smiled to himself. He did not search the reeds. He did not call out. Some meetings were complete precisely because they required no proof afterward. He adjusted the straps of his satchel and continued walking. Behind him, somewhere beyond the endless marsh and the patient mist, a forgotten kingdom rested peacefully beneath the stars, carrying its memories as gently as the water carried the sound of one faithful bell into the quiet of the coming night. The village emerged from the evening mist exactly as it had when the traveler had first arrived. The crooked cottages still leaned away from the marsh. Fishing nets still swayed gently in the cool breeze. Thin ribbons of smoke curled from chimneys into the darkening sky. Dogs rested near doorways, lifting their heads only briefly before deciding that this familiar wanderer required no further investigation. One old dog wagged its tail once, then returned to the important business of being comfortably asleep. The traveler respected such dedication. Inside the village, lanterns glowed warmly behind small windows. The comforting smell of fresh bread drifted through the quiet streets. Someone was stirring a pot of stew. Someone else was chopping firewood with slow, steady rhythm. Life had continued while he was away, as it always did. The old fisherman who had first spoken to him sat beside the little landing where several boats were tied. He looked up as the traveler approached. So, the fisherman smiled. "You found the marsh." "I did." "And?" The traveler sat beside him on the worn wooden bench. For several moments, neither man spoke. Finally, the fisherman asked the question that truly mattered. "Did you go looking for treasure?" The traveler smiled. "I thought I had." "And what did you bring back?" Instead of answering immediately, he reached into his satchel. The bronze key rested in one hand. The tiny woven ring of marsh reeds rested in the other. The fisherman studied both quietly. After a long pause, he nodded. "Ah, you understand?" "I think so." The traveler looked toward the silent marsh. They wanted to be remembered correctly. The old fisherman chuckled. "Most people do." They remained there until the first stars brightened overhead. The marsh stretched before them like an endless sea of silver and shadow. Somewhere far beyond the reeds, hidden beneath water and mist, rested the forgotten kingdom. No towers pierced the horizon, no walls could be seen, only stillness. Yet now the traveler knew exactly where to look, not with his eyes, with memory. An eccentric historical curiosity came gently to mind. Across medieval Europe, many villages preserved their history, not through written records, but through storytellers who repeated names, journeys, and local traditions from one generation to the next. In countless places, memory itself served as the strongest archive. Perhaps that had always been enough. The fisherman eventually rose. "You'll stay the night." "I think I will. The stew's better today." "How can you tell?" "My wife made it." The traveler laughed. "A convincing argument." "It usually is." Together they walked back through the quiet village. Children chased one another between cottages until sleepy parents called them inside. A cat sat proudly atop a fence, observing everyone with the unmistakable confidence of someone convinced it owned both the village and the moon. No one challenged this belief. It hardly seemed worth the effort. Later that evening, gathered around a warm fire, several villagers asked whether he had found anything beyond the marsh. He looked at their curious faces. Some expected tales of buried gold. Others hoped for ancient kings. One little boy seemed particularly interested in dragons. Children often preferred their history with significantly more wings. The traveler smiled. "I found a city." The room grew still. "A beautiful one." "What happened to it?" asked the basket weaver. "It remembered." The villagers exchanged puzzled glances. He continued. "It remembered its people. The bakers, the boat builders, the healers, the children, the old neighbors who argued about fishing docks." A few smiles appeared. "It remembered that kindness lasts longer than stone." No one interrupted. The old fisherman simply nodded, as though he had expected no other answer. The traveler never mentioned Edrin by name. Some stories belonged to those who first carried them. Instead, he spoke of ordinary lives, of quiet courage, of families planting trees before beginning new journeys, of roads built carefully enough to outlive the kingdoms that made them, of bells that continued marking the hours because water patiently remembered its path. When he finished, silence filled the room. Not uncomfortable silence, thoughtful silence. Finally, the oldest woman smiled. "I suppose," she said softly, "we should keep leaving bread for the marsh." The traveler smiled. "I think it would appreciate that." The next morning dawned clear and bright. Mist still floated above the wetlands, though thinner now beneath the rising sun. The traveler packed his belongings. The bronze key remained safely tucked inside his satchel. Beside it rested the little woven ring. Already the reeds had begun drying further. One day they would become brittle. Eventually, they would crumble. That seemed perfectly right. Some memories endured through stone, others through fragile things carried gently. Before leaving, he climbed the same little hill overlooking the marsh. The water shimmered peacefully. Birds rose from the reeds. Dragonflies danced above quiet pools. There was no sign of the ancient causeway, no glimpse of towers, no distant statues, only the endless marsh. Anyone else might have believed the stories were merely legends. He knew otherwise. He placed one hand upon the satchel at his side. Far away, carried so faintly that it might easily have been mistaken for the breeze itself. A single bell rang. He smiled. Then he turned and continued down the road, carrying no treasure that thieves would ever desire, no map that ambitious rulers could ever follow, and no secret capable of making him wealthy. Instead, he carried something far rarer. The quiet certainty that the greatest kingdoms are not always remembered because they were the strongest. Sometimes they are remembered because for a little while they taught ordinary people how to live together with extraordinary gentleness. And somewhere beneath the patient marsh, where reeds whispered softly above ancient stone and clear water, flowed through forgotten channels, an old keeper smiled, knowing that at last the story would travel farther than the roads of his kingdom ever had. The road stretches onward, beneath a sky that slowly darkens into velvet blue, and the sounds of the marsh grow softer with every imagined step. The reeds sway in an easy rhythm, the water reflects quiet stars, and the evening breeze carries only the gentle scent of earth, wild mint, and distant flowers settling in for the night. There is nothing left to chase now. No mysteries demanding answers, no hidden gates waiting to be opened. Only the comforting thought that some places are perfectly content to exist without asking anything from the world, except a little kindness in return. Perhaps that forgotten kingdom still rests beneath calm waters, exactly where it belongs, watched over by patient birds, faithful bells, and memories carried gently from one traveler to the next. Its streets remain peaceful, its gardens bloom in quiet seasons, and its stories drift as softly as mist across the marsh when dawn first arrives. And as your own thoughts become lighter, you can leave those ancient roads behind, knowing they will always be there whenever imagination wishes to wander again. The old stones ask for nothing. The marsh keeps its gentle watch. The stars continue their slow journey overhead. Everything is quiet. Everything is safe. And somewhere, almost too faint to hear, one last bell marks the passing of another peaceful hour before its echo disappears into the stillness, leaving only calm, restful silence